Welcome to the Slut Next Door podcast, where we dive deep into desire, unravel kinks and fetishes, and explore the deliciously naughty side of self-discovery. I'm Beatrix Vale, an erotic audio creator, and your guide to all things kinky and curious. So let's begin. Today we're talking about the shrinking fetish and Giantess Kink. I'm going to walk you through what this fantasy actually is, the different ways it shows up, and why it pulls so strongly on the mind. We'll look at the psychology behind size and power, why becoming small can feel like relief, and how the giantess figure shifts between different kinds of roles like nurturing, control, and even indifference. I also want to explore why this dynamic resonates so deeply for men who are used to carrying responsibility, and why audio, imagination, and voice play such a powerful role in bringing it to life. So if you've ever been curious about what it means to feel small in a controlled, intentional way, this episode will help you understand exactly what's happening underneath that pull. And I'll go ahead and start with, I see the two, shrinking and giantess, almost like two separate worlds, but also kind of the same. We'll dig into that a little later. But before we get into the topic at hand, I'm going to talk about what's currently making me feel like a goddess. And this is a small segment I started because, I don't know, I'm just in my goddess era, and I want to talk about what's currently making me feel like a goddess. And right now, the first thing that came to mind was it being spring. So as I'm recording this episode, we are definitely within spring. And I don't know, there's something that makes me feel connected to the world outside in nature. Something about the warmth of the sun, the air feeling like it's just inviting me like outside. And it really, when you walk outside and you see the growth happening, I can't help but think about my own growth and how sometimes growth doesn't like ask if it's allowed. Like the earth, Mother Nature doesn't do that. It doesn't ask our permission to go through its seasons. It just happens. And I love that kind of connection. I personally love aligning myself to what's going on outside in Mother Nature. It absolutely makes me feel like a goddess. And spring just has me feeling more in my body. Like I said, just that sun on your skin, everything just feels more alive. I love it. That's what's making me currently feel like a goddess. So with that said, let's jump into the shrinking fetish and Giantess Kink. So let's put some language around it. The shrinking fetish is the desire to become tiny, like to be reduced in size and then placed into this new setting where suddenly everything feels overwhelming, immersive, and sometimes intimate in completely different ways. Because when you are super tiny in size and the other person is regular size, it kind of takes away regular sexual activities. And that's the fun part of it. And then you have the giantess side of it. So when you have the word giantess, it's just a woman who is massive, towering. And sometimes she can be nurturing, sometimes she can be dominant, sometimes she can be completely indifferent, like does not care about the tiny people around her. But I think that is the key to these kinds of role plays because the giantess, or if we're just talking shrinking, the woman in the role play, she kind of takes on different roles, like seeing you, taking care of you, controlling you, and sometimes having you barely exist at all, or even kind of playfully torturing you. You know, each of those hits completely different psychological notes. And before I move on to kind of the more psychological notes of all this, you can see where these two terms, giantess and shrink, are the same but different. You know, if you're being shrunk to a small size, then the woman does become a giantess in that moment. But I have found that men I have gotten to know through creating content for them that are into shrinking fetish, of course, they're not going to say no to giantess content, but it's more about them being shrunk, like that whole experience. And yes, she becomes a giantess, but it's more about the actual shrinking, where giantess content can be people are their regular size, but this giantess is just massive, like Godzilla size. So no one was really shrunk. However, in a way, the regular people do shrink a bit because of her perspective. So I do see them as two separate worlds, but overlap for sure. So let's talk about why these kinks exist. And of course, as always, this is where it gets really interesting for me. So, of course, I think our brains use size as a shortcut to define things because typically big means powerful and small means vulnerable. So, in these role plays, if you become tiny, you are not doing any type of leading. You are not a dominant figure because you're so tiny. You don't even have to decide, you don't have to carry anything. I mean, nothing is expected of you except to be this tiny little thing. There's no expectations placed on you. And I think for a lot of people, especially men who are used to being in control and being responsible and being relied on, those experiences, not having to lead, not having to decide, that's just a relief. And there's something really quiet about it, and also can be pretty arousing for them. And then you've got the surrender aspect of it all. So if you're small enough, resistance doesn't even make sense anymore. You know, like if I'm a woman who can magically shrink you down, you can't even resist. You can't even run away from me. So that becomes appealing too because you are kind of forced to surrender. And then so that adds a layer, or rather it removes a layer of pressure that most people, I think, don't even realize they're carrying. So in a role play where I shrink a man down, he doesn't have any choice but to surrender. And that right there is appealing to a lot of men, especially ones that feel a bit conflicted about submitting. They have that ego still in place. But in a role play where a woman shrinks you down, then there is no resisting surrendering to her. And in these role plays, I also see this sort of regression, and not in a way that's like inherently sexual, but in a way that feels simpler. Like there's a smaller world and fewer expectations. And I think it hits on those really primal feelings like of wanting to be held, to be owned, to just exist and be part of someone bigger than you. That's getting pretty deep there when you really think about it, but I definitely see that aspect sometimes coming out of these role plays. And another part of these role plays that I personally love because I'm lightly sadistic is um, I think that in these role plays, there's a sense of insignificance. So if I shrink you down, it's the idea that for a moment you don't even matter because you're so small, you can't do anything for me. And that becomes like super peaceful for some people, especially ones that crave that kind of ego bursting and humiliation in a way that becomes something they chase after. So now let's talk about the giantess archetype. And I've actually, I believe, gone over this archetype before, but we're going to do it again. So the giantess archetype, she's not just big, she becomes something else entirely. So when a woman is scaled up like that, she stops just being a person and becomes a whole fucking environment. I mean, her presence fills everything. And then in that moment, her voice is going to be louder and more significant. Her movements even become heavier. And her attention, especially if you're super small, becomes even more meaningful. Or the lack of attention even does something too. But I think there's many different roles this archetype can take on as well. I think that the giantess can become a sort of caretaker. So someone that watches over you, keeps you safe, protects you, um, feeling like she's in control because she's the absolute authority. And also becomes the one who decides what happens to you, where you go, how you're handled. So I see that there's a sort of caretaker role that she can take on. I also feel like there can be a strong overlap with that mommy energy, the nurturing and control, softness and certainty. Um, and so let's add in another layer that's a bit different. The giantess goddess kind of layer. So when a woman is scaled up into an impossible size, she's elevated. She becomes untouchable and an archetype that you could worship, existing on a level that obviously you don't even reach. And this is a layer of this archetype that I, for one, love because it just immediately gives the character so much power, just goddess level power. And I love it. I think it becomes intoxicating, well, for me, but also more importantly, intoxicating for the person on the other side. So now I'm going to talk about the spectrum of these two kinks. And I feel like it can hit so many directions. And I thought it might be fun too to tell you about my history into these kinks. So, thinking back, I think the first giantess theme I had played with was a very long time ago when I first started doing audios. I had someone ask me for a giantess role play. And in the story, it wasn't shrinking, it was giantess. And I was this woman who terrorized this town and just destroyed everything around me for fun and for sport. And what was interesting, I remember noticing there was very little sexual elements to his role play, to his requests. There was some, but not a lot. It was definitely more how this woman just caused pure chaos and this city and really gave zero shits about any of the people. um, yeah, it was just a very dominant, kind of bratty giantess role play. And I remember thinking it was so fun. Like it was different, but I remember getting done with it and thinking, man, this was a lot of fun because I got to just, like I said, play this bratty role. And I love when people push me creatively. I love it. And here recently, I feel like I've really been pushed into shrinking from one particular special boy. And I love it. I love it. And I can see my own fans becoming also or starting to become enamored with the kink. I wouldn't say all of them, but some. And that makes me so happy because I love having a variety in my own personal library. But it's such a fun role play for me to take on the shrinking because I get to be creative. So kind of like I just mentioned, I love being pushed creatively. And like the roles that I take on in these role plays are devious and a little evil, and I love it. So yeah, that's my own personal experience with it. And I would say that history is pretty short, but from digging into my one special boy, digging into his thoughts about it, interacting with him, and then thinking about the kink in a very objective way, I feel like I understand it. And I was just reminded that I think recently what probably led shrinking fans to me was I did a file called Tet Addict Trance. And in the file, I make my breasts inflate. And so through that, you, the listener, become a little smaller because I'm inflating and that's making you feel smaller. So I think that might have been a little flag to the shrink fans. You can let me know if you're one of my shrink fans, if that was what drew you to me specifically. I think that might have been it. But regardless, I'm so glad that I make the content because it's so fun. And I feel like, that's the beauty of kink, but also audio is that you can make anything happen in audio. Shrinking fetish obviously isn't realistic. Like I can't make you shrink down. I wish I could. That would be fun. But it's not realistic. So when you hear it, it just becomes this fun fantasy world that both of us can go into where I get to have fun with you and you just get to pretend that you're small and insignificant if that's applicable. And yeah, just enjoy the fantasy element of it all. But anyway, let's get into the spectrums of this kink. So, like I said, I feel like shrinking or a giantess can be gentle. I don't think I have any files where I'm gentle and a giantess or I'm the one shrinking, but I do. There are some elements though within it. I actually did a hypno recently where I shrink down the listener, and he just goes into my pocket, and I lovingly put him there, and yeah, he's held in my hand, in the palm of my hand, and there's a sense of fear there, of course, but there's also a sense of like safety in a way. Like you don't even have to stand. Like I'm gonna hold you. And then you've got the far end, so this opposite end, where if you're shrunk down or if you're in the midst of a giantess, you're just simply existing in her space. Like you're not even in her attention because you're so small. You're so insignificant. How can you how can you even do anything for her because you're that small? And in my opinion, at least the people I've interacted with into these kinds of kinks, this is what they're drawn to, that sort of being so small, you're insignificant. And I think they're drawn to that because it becomes this strange, powerful feeling, and that's submission right there. I mean, that's the core of submitting is taking away your own quote unquote power, your own control, and you just become in the hands of someone else. And within the kink, I probably should have put this in the first section where I talked about like defining. So, because these are erotic in theme, there's lots of things that could happen there. And I honestly don't know too much because I haven't really done much of Vore. So, Vore eroticizes the act of consuming or being consumed. So, it's like the giantess may pick up the tiny person and just stick them right into her mouth. And like I said, I haven't really dove into this myself, so I don't know too much about it. But it also reminds me this actually should have been my first intro into this kink world. I was just reminded explaining Vore. I remember it was like I was so new to phone sex as a phone sex operator, and I was having this sexting session with a customer, and he hadn't let on that he was into giantess. I think he was skirting around it, and he had asked me to send a picture of my mouth. And so I did. And he's like, no, 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 closer to your mouth. So then I realized he wanted me to open up my mouth and take a picture of the inside of my mouth. And when when I did, he's like, oh, mommy, your teeth are so big. And so we just kind of role played like that. I could tell where he was going. Oh, those big teeth, they could just, whatever. I don't remember the specifics, but I remember being so fascinated by that because I could tell in that moment that he was wanting to feel super small and that my mouth was just enormous and my tongue was enormous, so that's Vore. That's a whole nother, lane of these kinks. And what I have done some in audio is, and I don't know if this is considered Vore or not. Now that I'm thinking, I don't know, but in audio, I have played with insertion. So if you're tiny, I'm going to stick you somewhere, somewhere private, somewhere very wet, uh, stick you in my holes, and so that becomes fun because then the body part that a man is so attracted to becomes this enormous size. I mean, like I said, the tit addict trans, that I feel like that's where the shrinking happens when I made my breasts expand. And, in the shrinking fetish, that's also very arousing, where you get to, kind of just take a ride on the curve of my breast, and you're so tiny that you stand on my erect nipple. And what I really like about the shrinking role plays that I do is I get to be so playful. I get to think of these really interesting ways to play with this tiny, tiny, couple inch man. Uh, you can be a nipple charm. You can be a straw charm. Uh, I can stick you places. You can tickle my sensitive places with your tiny little limbs. Just all these like really fun, creative ways to. And when I say torture, and I think that's how it's presented, like, "Oh, I'm gonna torture you by stuffing you in my bra where it's dark and sweaty," but that actually isn't really torture, it's actually something they want. They want to feel so small, and, I'm thinking of my particular shrinking guy, and I love how he has these creative ways that he'd still like to please me as he's tiny. And I see that as a little bit of his ego still sticking around. Even though I'm a couple inches tall, I can still make you feel good. Uh, but yeah, it's because at that point, when let's say you're 2 inches tall, we're not going to have sex. That's impossible, right? So then it becomes, what can I do with you that either entertains me or turns me on or whatever. And something I really, really like personally about doing shrinking giantess type of audios is how deliciously evil I get to be. Because I think that in my mind, when I'm doing this role play, if I'm the type of woman that's going to shrink you, I'm pretty evil in the best way, So I get to really hype up that kind of energy, this wicked woman who's going to shrink you down to the size of a quarter and all the crazy things I'm going to do with you just because it's fun. Because at that point, I don't like, you're useless for any other reason. And so yeah, it's such a fun kink. I love that I am knee deep in it. It's really fun. Um, lots of different ways, you can go with that. I recently did a cuck one. So I shrink down my husband in the role play, and then I get to do what I want. I get to have sex with other men, but I'm still going to, of course, quote unquote, torture my husband by, bringing him along to my dates, leaving him in a little cage that's dangling from a pendant on my necklace, or putting him in my cleavage, all these evil ways of including him in my cuck adventures. Yeah, it's so fun. It really is so fun. And like I said, that's why I'm just such a fan of creating audios, because anything can happen in them. We can make anything happen. And sure, there are creators that create Giantess content and video, and that can be done with, camera angles and such. But I do feel like you're a little limited, where audio, you can close your eyes. And if you're the type of person that has an active imagination, then I feel like audio is the perfect medium if you're a fan of this type of content. Your brain doesn't need visuals to understand scale. It just needs like the cues. And that's what audio is about, making something happen with my words, with my descriptions, telling you how to feel and what to see in your mind's eye. And, having your imagination become the engine of the fantasy. And because there's no visual limits, like if I were to create a video using scale and stuff, there's certain things I can't do in that video, where in audio, you're not confined to what something looks like. You're experiencing what it feels like. And then your brain just fills in the rest. And another great thing about audio is there's audio effects that I can use. I've been experimenting with this as well, and I think it's like really turning out to add just a whole nother level to it. So, for example, I have a file called Pussy Hex, and it's where I shrink the listener down and then I stick him inside. And in that moment where I do stick you inside, I think even before then, yeah, when I start to shrink the listener down, I add in a heartbeat sound effect, like dun 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 dun. And that's because when you become small, well, guess what's going to happen? Like my heartbeat sounds like, drums, because you're that small. And so then when I stick him inside, I was able to kind of muffle my voice and make it sound like you're inside of a cave. And I think it just worked out so well. The heartbeat, I forgot how I changed the heartbeat in the audio, but it changed as well during that moment. So yeah, there's fun things I can do that way. What else have I done? Oh, recently I played with the size of my voice. So as the listener is shrinking in the hypno, I started putting effects on my voice that make my chest sound larger, that, just a simple gradual volume boost on my voice, making it sound larger with reverb. There's just lots of things that you can do in audio that just add to the experience for sure. And the other thing I do, this is not effects that I do like in post editing. Something that I've always done with these shrinking or giantess audios is amping up my teasing and amping up having fun. Because I mentioned it earlier, when I put myself into the character in the role play, and that's what I do before I record, I really try to feel like I am that person. And I guess that's probably like some sort of method acting or whatever. So when I put myself in the shoes of a woman that's shrinking a man, she is quite deliciously evil, and she likes to have fun with it, because why else would she do it? I mean, she's a little sadistic and probably likes having the power of shrinking a man down. And so that's something I'm always doing in a shrinking audio is bringing that type of energy where I get extra teasing and just have fun because it is fun. It is a more fun fantasy. And I believe that a woman that shrinks men just loves to tease men. So that's something I'm going to bring as well. But I'm going to leave you with one little question to think about. So maybe you were listening to this episode to try to understand the kink. So this question isn't for you if you're just a curious mind and nothing really spoke to you. But if something did hit something inside on any of the topics or themes or ideas that I spoke of, I think that you should think about what part of you responded to any of the role plays I discussed or any of the ideas. What part of you softens at the idea, or what part of you feels quiet in the best way, or even what part of you feels a little scared. When I say scared, I mean that fear boner. Really try to figure out what it is inside that causes those feelings. And maybe even think about what would happen if you let yourself experience that feeling, even just a little, like through an audio. So if you have never heard my audios, I would suggest you go to the link and the description of this episode to see where I post files. I don't believe I have anything public free that's within this topic. Maybe to addict trans, there's a little bit of shrinking element of that, but I definitely do have some shrinking themed audios. Check them out in that link if you would like. But regardless, I would love to thank you for tuning into this episode. I hope it was fun for you. And never forget that even our sexuality is allowed to have fun. Never forget that. Sometimes I think that people take sex and kink a little bit too seriously. Sometimes it just feels great to have a little fun. And that's a wrap for this episode of The Slut Next Door, where we dive deep into the raw, unapologetic truths of human desire. If you loved what you heard today, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a juicy moment. Want to connect with me outside the podcast? Click the link in my bio where you can find lots of juicy content and options. Until next time, I'm Beatrix Vale, your Slut Next Door, and I'll see you in the next episode.